All right, so as we have spoken about on many different occasions, I was about to say Lauren Southern is a moron. I mean, roaming millennial is a moron. So she was quote tweeting this tweet here that says only 15%. It says only 15% of whites see their racial identity as important. The majority of every other racial group sees it as important. And this graph says blacks are more likely than other groups to see their race or ethnicity as central to their identity. And then it has black people at 52% saying it's extremely important, very important at 22%, Hispanic at 31 being extremely and very important being 28. And it has Asian at 27 being extremely important and very important at 28. And then it has, for white people, only 5% is extremely important, while 10% is very important. So, listen, man, this is something that is very obvious as to why the numbers are how they are. And I mean, anybody with two brain cells to rub together can understand why that is what it is. Now, let's see what Genius Galaxy Brain, Roaming Millennial, had to say about this. She says, if the idea of white racial identity frightens you, ask yourself whether you feel the same about black or Hispanic racial identity. If not, why not? Progressives embrace non-white racial identitarianism, yet are horrified when white people begin to express the same sentiments. Here's the problem, and this is like the hackiest, like Tim Pool style garbage I've ever seen in my entire life. And here's why. So the chart is specifically, asking people whether they see their race as important. So the reason why black people find their race to be important is because they're affected by it in their daily lives. So we've already gone through all of the evidence that there exists a system of institutional racism in the United States. Now, institutional is different from overt, in which in an overt system there are literally laws on the books. They're based in racism. In institutional oppression, there's none of them are, there's no laws on the books, but it's a function, it's what you get from the result and the expressions of the political and social institutions that exist in the nation. So, what are some of those things? We know that controlling for the same crime in all factors, black people are more likely to get a sentence with the mandatory minimum sentence. They're also likely to be charged harsher. And they're also more likely to be sentenced much, much harder. I think it might be, actually that percent might be from a different statistic, but they're extremely more likely to be given a harsher sentence than a white person, despite having the same record and everything controlled. That comes from multiple studies. I read a study from one of the, I think it was University of Michigan Law or something like that. I forget exactly which school it was. The Booker Report, I believe, is released like every 4 years. We also know that the marijuana rates of arrest are way through the roof, despite the fact that their usage rates are basically the same. We also know that if you have a black-sounding first name, you're much more likely to not get a call back, despite either having the same record or having a slightly slightly better record than a white-sounding name in the United States. And that's amongst a slew of different things that exist. And also you have to take into account, obviously, that generational wealth is mostly dependent upon homes, and when your people are essentially, they were literally discriminated against in housing, and so they weren't actually able to get homes. And when you don't have that kind of generational wealth of a house, you're going to be horrible, and that's a really big predictor as to how you're going to end up being. So that's the reason why black people see their racial identity as important. And it doesn't make sense as to why white people would have some white nationalist or, and I don't think that black nationalism is something that I don't support that either. But that's not what the survey is asking here. And I think she's trying to equate the two, as if saying that your racial identity is important is the same as being a black nationalist or something like that, which it isn't. You understand the history of your race and all of the things that currently affect you to this day. Obviously, it's going to be important. White people aren't, they're not the ones on the flip side of all those statistics and facts I just gave you. They weren't the ones who were victims of 200 years of slavery and then Jim Crow on top of that and housing discrimination. And they're not the ones today who, despite having similar usage rates, are far more likely to be arrested for pot. They're not the ones who are getting the harsher sentences, more likely to be given a sentence with the mandatory minimum, more likely to be charged harsher than a black person. That they're not on the flip side of those things. So obviously none of that affects you. Why would why would it be important to you? There's nothing of importance historically nor today. So that's obviously why. Now, I don't support black nationalism or white nationalism, but white nationalism has no whatsoever basis in anything logical, because obviously, you know, in a certain situation, you can understand, like, Malcolm X, the first version of Malcolm X, where I think he basically was a black nationalist at that point. And he ended up changing more into sort of like an MLK type of person later on in his life. But that's a sort of thing that you can understand from the perspective of a black person, especially in those times that Malcolm X lived in, right? That was the pre-Civil Rights era, pre the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Malcolm X, right? So you can understand a perspective like that. When you're talking about white people in the United States, there's no justification for even having an inkling or like an appeal to white nationalism. But that's not even the convo we're having here, because I don't like black nationalism either. We're all equals, and so there's no reason to have any, you know, separate countries. We're all equals, should be treated as equals in our, you know, in this country, in our country. So there's no need for that, obviously. But there's an obvious difference as to why, and roaming is just so fucking stupid.